The knock came at 5:02 a.m., sharp and insistent, the kind that didn't belong to delivery drivers or neighbors borrowing sugar. I was already half awake, conditioned by years of early mornings and rigid routines, and the sound cut straight through me like a blade. When I opened the door, my neighbor stood there fully dressed, shoes on, eyes wide but steady, as if they'd rehearsed this moment and were relieved it had finally arrived. "Don't go to work today," they said before I could speak. "Just trust me." There was no apology in their voice, no explanation, only urgency wrapped in calm, and before I could ask anything useful, they turned and walked back down the hallway. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the closed door across the hall, trying to decide whether what had just happened belonged to the category of coincidence or warning. My neighbor wasn't dramatic. They weren't prone to pranks or exaggeration. We exchanged nods, sometimes brief conversations about trash pickup or weather, nothing that suggested 5 a.m. interventions. My instinct was irritation, followed quickly by the familiar comfort of routine asserting itself. I had a meeting at 9. A commute time to the minute. A day already decided. And yet, as I shut my door, the words lingered, "not go to work," echoing in a way that felt less like advice and more like a line drawn in chalk I wasn't supposed to cross. I moved through my apartment on autopilot, coffee brewing, phone charging, keys laid out in their usual place, trying to reassert control by doing what I always did. Routine had always been my proof against anxiety. If I followed it, things stayed predictable. Safe. I told myself the knock was just an anomaly, a neighbor having a bad night, maybe a misunderstanding. But the image of their face, serious, intent, unblinking, kept intruding. There had been no drama in it, no attempt to persuade. That unsettled me more than if they'd begged. People who ask you to trust them without explanation usually don't do it lightly. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling untouched, staring at the calendar notification blinking insistently on my phone. Part of me wanted to laugh at myself for hesitating. I'd never skipped work without a concrete reason. I prided myself on reliability, on showing up even when it was inconvenient. That identity tugged at me now, urging me to dismiss the morning's interruption and proceed. But another part of me, quieter and harder to ignore, reminded me that this wasn't about inconvenience. It was about something I didn't yet understand. And not understanding didn't automatically mean it was meaningless. I tried to reconstruct the timeline, to find cracks where reason could slip in. Had anything strange happened recently? A tense email, an odd comment, a moment that felt off but passed too quickly to name? I thought about the building, the neighborhood, the job itself. Nothing surfaced immediately, which only made the absence of explanation louder. If my neighbor had wanted to scare me, they'd have said why. If they'd wanted attention, they'd have lingered. Instead, they delivered the message and left, as if the responsibility now rested entirely with me. That transfer, of knowledge without context, felt heavy in my hands. By 6, the sun had begun to lighten the edges of the sky, and with it came the creeping sense that the decision window was closing. Either I went, restoring the familiar order of my day, or I stayed and accepted the discomfort of uncertainty. I picked up my phone and texted my supervisor something vague about not feeling well, my thumb hovering before I hit send. It felt dishonest, and I disliked that. But honesty would require an explanation I didn't have. When the message went through, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, like I'd stepped off a moving walkway onto solid ground without knowing where I was standing. The hours that followed were restless. I paced. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. I checked my phone too often, half expecting a follow-up message from my neighbor that would make sense of everything. None came. The silence pressed in, and I wondered if I'd just allowed a stranger's odd behavior to derail my day for no reason. Doubt crept in, sharp and persistent. I imagined explaining this later, how ridiculous it would sound. I didn't go to work because my neighbor told me not to. The thought made my jaw tighten. Around 8, I heard movement in the hallway and cracked the door, hoping to catch my neighbor and demand clarity. The corridor was empty. Their door was closed. I considered knocking, then stopped. If they'd wanted to explain, they would have. The trust they'd asked for wasn't passive, it required me to sit with not knowing. That realization irritated me, then sobered me. Trust without information is a test, and I had already taken it by staying home. Backing out now, running to work late, pretending none of this had happened, felt like breaking something I couldn't name. By mid-morning, the apartment felt too small. I turned on the TV for background noise, then turned it off when the chatter became unbearable. I kept glancing at the clock, marking time in 10-minute increments, each one stretching longer than the last. I told myself I was being cautious, not paranoid. I told myself there was probably a mundane explanation waiting to surface. But beneath those reassurances was a growing awareness that something had already shifted. I had deviated from my routine for the first time in years, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to listen to a warning I didn't understand. When noon approached, a tightness settled in my chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation sharpened by uncertainty. I replayed the knock again, the exact phrasing, the way my neighbor's voice hadn't wavered. Just trust me. The simplicity of it felt deliberate, as if details would have only diluted the urgency. I realized then that whatever they knew, they believed timing mattered more than explanation. And as I watched the minute hand inch closer to 12, I understood that this day wasn't waiting for me to make sense of it. It was moving forward regardless. By the time I closed the door that morning, I already knew something was wrong, I just didn't know how wrong. By the time the clock hit 7:30 a.m., the day had already taken on a strange, stalled quality, like an engine turning over without catching. I sat on the edge of my couch with my laptop open, staring at emails I had no intention of answering, trying to convince myself that staying home had been a rational decision instead of an emotional one. I kept replaying the knock, the tone of my neighbor's voice, the way they hadn't looked surprised when I opened the door. That detail bothered me more than anything else. Surprise would have implied uncertainty. What I'd seen instead was resolve, as if they were checking off a necessary step before something unavoidable happened. I tried to impose structure on the morning, believing that if I followed enough of my usual routine, the unease would dissipate. I showered, got dressed in clothes I would normally wear to work, even packed my bag out of habit before setting it back down. The motions felt performative, like I was rehearsing normalcy without committing to it. Every few minutes, I checked my phone, not for messages but for reassurance, news alerts, emails, anything that would justify my decision retroactively. Nothing appeared. The absence of information felt louder than bad news would have. Around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from a coworker asking if I was running late. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, weighing how much truth to offer. I replied vaguely, saying I'd taken a day off, leaving out the reason entirely. The reply came back quickly, a thumbs up and a casual, "See you tomorrow." The normalcy of it made my stomach drop. If nothing was wrong, I'd just stayed home for nothing. If something was wrong, I'd narrowly avoided it without anyone knowing why. Either way, I felt suspended between outcomes, unable to commit emotionally to either. As the morning stretched on, my neighbor remained conspicuously absent. No sounds from their apartment. No footsteps in the hallway. I found myself listening for clues the way you listen for weather, subtle, ambient changes that signal something approaching. I told myself this was ridiculous, that I was projecting meaning onto silence. And yet, the longer the quiet lasted, the more deliberate it felt. I wondered if they were watching the clock the same way I was, waiting for a moment they knew was coming. That thought made my skin prickle. I tried to distract myself by thinking about work, about ongoing projects and unresolved tensions I'd brushed aside as routine stress. There had been a meeting scheduled for late morning, one that had felt heavier than usual when the invite landed in my inbox days earlier. I remembered an email thread that had ended abruptly, a colleague who'd seemed unusually tense the last time we spoke. At the time, I'd dismissed it as nothing. Now, with too much time to think and not enough information to anchor me, those small details resurfaced, rearranging themselves into something that felt less random. By 10:30, the anxiety had shifted into something sharper. My heart wasn't racing, but my thoughts were, circling the same questions without landing anywhere useful. I wondered what kind of knowledge would compel someone to knock on a neighbor's door before sunrise and tell them not to go to work. Not to be careful. Not to watch out. Not to leave early or take a different route. Don't go. The simplicity of the instructions suggested finality, as if proximity itself was the risk. That interpretation unsettled me more than any specific imagined scenario. At 10:47 a.m., my phone buzzed again, this time with a different tone, an alert instead of a message. I didn't open it immediately. I sat there, staring at the screen, aware of my own hesitation. Part of me wanted to freeze the moment, to stay in the uneasy limbo of not knowing rather than confirm whatever was waiting on the other side of the notification. When I finally unlocked the screen, the headline was vague but unmistakable, and my breath caught as the pieces I'd been holding separately began to slide toward alignment. I didn't yet understand the full picture, not then. But I understood enough to know that the day hadn't stalled, it had been winding up. The knock, the warning, the silence afterward, all of it was converging on something I had narrowly stepped out of the path of. I set the phone down slowly, my hands unsteady, and looked around my apartment with new eyes. The familiar space felt suddenly provisional, like a safe room I hadn't known I needed until I was already inside it. As noon crept closer, the weight of that realization settled deeper, heavier with every passing minute. I wasn't just absent from work that day. I had been removed from a sequence of events I didn't yet fully comprehend. The day hadn't started because it was waiting, for the news to break, for the reason to surface, for the truth my neighbor had trusted me to sit with in advance. And as the clock edged toward 12, I understood that whatever came next would explain everything I'd been struggling to rationalize since dawn. At 10:47 a.m., my phone buzzed, and the tone of the day changed instantly. After the alert, time stopped behaving the way I expected it to. Minutes didn't move forward so much as pile up on top of each other, heavy and disorienting. I read the headline again, then a third time, trying to keep my breathing steady while my mind raced ahead of the information available. It was still incomplete, still developing, the kind of early report that raises more questions than it answers. An incident at my workplace. Emergency services on site. No confirmed details yet. I sat back on the couch, phone resting in my palm, and for the first time that morning, fear crept in, not loud or panicked, but cold and precise. My first instinct was to call someone. Anyone. A coworker, my supervisor, even my neighbor. I stopped myself midway through unlocking my phone. If my neighbor had wanted to explain, they would have. Whatever they knew, they'd chosen restraint over reassurance. That choice felt intentional now, almost ethical. They hadn't told me what would happen. They'd told me what to do. And somehow, that distinction mattered. I realized I didn't want to contaminate what little clarity I had with speculation or half-truths from people who were still inside the unfolding situation. Instead, I replayed the past few weeks in my head, combing through them with a focus I hadn't applied at the time. There had been signs, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious enough to trigger alarm on its own. Security drills that felt more tense than usual. A temporary access restriction that had been explained away as maintenance. The way certain conversations stopped abruptly when I walked into a room. At the time, I'd chalked it up to corporate chaos, the background noise of any large workplace. Now, those moments rearranged themselves into something sharper, more deliberate. I thought about my neighbor then, about how little I actually knew them. We'd lived across the hall from each other for years, exchanging pleasantries and occasional favors, but never personal details. I didn't know where they worked, or what their days looked like beyond the brief overlaps in the hallway. That anonymity had always felt neutral, even comforting. Now it felt strategic. They'd known enough about my schedule to catch me before I left. They'd known enough to understand urgency. And they'd known enough to trust me with silence instead of explanation. As more updates trickled in, the shape of the situation became clearer, though no less unsettling. Evacuations. A lockdown. Investigators on site. The language remained careful, but the implications were obvious. This wasn't a minor disruption. This was the kind of event that rewrote a day, and potentially much more. I imagined my usual route, the time I would have arrived, the place I would have been standing when everything changed. The thought made my chest tighten. The distance between where I was and where I should have been felt impossibly thin. I wondered how my neighbor had learned about it ahead of time. The question circled relentlessly. Were they connected to someone at my workplace? Had they overheard something they weren't supposed to? Had they noticed a pattern I'd missed entirely? Each possibility carried its own weight, its own ethical complexity. Knowing something dangerous before it happens is a burden most people never carry. Choosing what to do with that knowledge, who to tell, how much to say, when to intervene, felt like a moral crossroads I was only now beginning to appreciate. By late morning, the news had escalated from alerts to live coverage. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, close enough to feel real but far enough to remain abstract. I watched footage from angles that felt uncomfortably familiar, places I'd passed through hundreds of times now framed by flashing lights and caution tape. The unreality of it all pressed in, the dissonance between the safety of my apartment and the chaos unfolding elsewhere. I hadn't just avoided inconvenience. I had avoided proximity. And proximity, I realized, had been the entire point of the warning. I paced the apartment, restless energy buzzing under my skin. Every object felt suddenly charged with significance, as if my morning routine had been interrupted at exactly the right moment to preserve this version of reality. I kept thinking about how easily I could have dismissed the knock. How close I'd come to doing exactly that. The difference between showing up and staying home had felt trivial at the time, a minor deviation. Now it loomed large, a hinge moment I couldn't stop replaying. The fear, when it fully arrived, came paired with something else, gratitude edged with responsibility. Someone had intervened on my behalf without asking for credit, without demanding acknowledgement. They'd trusted me to act, not to understand. That trust sat heavily with me, reshaping how I thought about community, about the quiet ways people look out for each other without announcement. I realized how rare that kind of intervention was, and how easily it could be dismissed as paranoia if handled differently. As noon approached, clarity sharpened into certainty. I wasn't imagining the connection. The knock hadn't been coincidence. My neighbor hadn't guessed. They had known enough to act decisively and little enough to avoid overstepping. Whatever line they'd been walking, they'd chosen to cross it for me. The thought left me unsteady, humbled by the realization that someone else had made a judgment call that altered my trajectory without my consent, and had done it to protect me. I sat down again, phone in hand, watching the minute hand inch closer to 12. The updates were more detailed now, the language firmer, the scope undeniable. My hands trembled slightly as I set the phone down, palms flat on my knees, grounding myself in the present. I was here. Safe. Unhurt. And the reason for that safety was standing just across the hall, behind a closed door, waiting for a moment they'd clearly been counting toward as carefully as I had. By the time the clock hit noon, the question wasn't whether my neighbor had saved me from something. It was what, exactly, they had saved me from. And how they had carried that knowledge long enough to make the right choice. My heart pounded as understanding settled in, heavy and undeniable. Whatever I had narrowly avoided, it wasn't abstract anymore. It was real. And it was enough to make my hands shake as the final pieces fell into place. By the time I realized what they'd actually stopped me from walking into, my hands were shaking. At exactly noon, the tone of the coverage changed, and with it, something inside me dropped away, leaving a hollow space where certainty rushed in. The news anchors stopped speculating and started confirming. Words like contained and no further threat appeared at the bottom of the screen, followed closely by phrases that made my stomach tighten: multiple injuries, ongoing investigation, employees accounted for. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, watching images of my workplace fill the screen, angles I recognized instantly, entrances I'd walked through thousands of times now framed by emergency vehicles and barriers that hadn't been there this morning. The camera panned across the front of the building, lingering just long enough for me to orient myself. I knew exactly where I would have been at that hour. I knew the rhythm of my mornings well enough to place myself in those shots with unnerving accuracy. The realization hit me in waves, each one stronger than the last. If I'd followed my routine, if I'd dismissed the knock as nonsense, I would have been there, standing in the middle of a scene that now felt distant and unreal only because I wasn't part of it. I turned the volume down, unable to absorb any more details without my thoughts spiraling ahead of the facts. My heart pounded steadily, not wildly, but insistently, like it was trying to make sure I stayed present. Survivor's guilt crept in quietly, uninvited. Why me? Why had I been spared when others hadn't? The randomness of it all unsettled me more than any single confirmed detail. This wasn't about deserving or preparation. It was about timing and proximity, about a decision made before sunrise that had quietly rerouted my day, and possibly my life. As more information came in, the pieces aligned with painful clarity. The timing. The location. The area that had been evacuated was the same floor where my team worked. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining familiar faces and unfamiliar circumstances, and felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief tangled with dread, gratitude mixed with helplessness. I reached for my phone instinctively, scrolling through messages as coworkers checked in, reassured each other, processed what had happened in fragments. No one asked why I wasn't there. No one needed to. The absence felt both invisible and enormous. I stood and walked to the window, grounding myself in the ordinary sight of the street below. Cars passed. Someone walked a dog. Life continued, indifferent to the weight pressing against my chest. That contrast made my legs feel weak. Just hours ago, I'd been annoyed at an interruption to my routine. Now, I was staring at a reality I hadn't entered by a margin so small it felt obscene. The difference between showing up and staying home had never felt so stark, so consequential. My thoughts kept circling back to my neighbor. I imagined them watching the same coverage, waiting for the moment when the truth became undeniable. I wondered what it had cost them to knock on my door that morning, to intervene without explanation and walk away without knowing whether I'd listen. They must have known this moment was coming, the point where everything would make sense to me without them having to say another word. That knowledge reframed the morning entirely. The knock hadn't been a warning born of panic. It had been a calculated act of care. As the initial shock settled, another realization surfaced, quieter but no less powerful. I wasn't late to work that day. I hadn't skipped out or taken a day off on a whim. I had been spared. The language mattered. It shifted how I understood my role in what hadn't happened. I hadn't escaped by chance alone. Someone else had seen the risk and chosen to redirect me, trusting that I'd comply without understanding why. That trust humbled me more than the fear ever could. I sat back down, hands clasped tightly, breathing slowly until the tension eased enough for me to think clearly again. The images on the screen blurred slightly as tears gathered, not from panic, but from the delayed impact of what I'd narrowly avoided. I let them fall without wiping them away, a small acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. This wasn't something to rush past or minimize. It deserved space, even if that space was uncomfortable. By early afternoon, the immediate crisis had passed, but the day felt irrevocably altered. Messages continued to arrive, each one reinforcing the same truth from a different angle. People were shaken. People were safe. People were trying to make sense of how close things had come to being worse. I read quietly, responding when necessary, careful not to center myself in a story that wasn't mine to tell. And yet, privately, I couldn't ignore how deeply personal it felt. I had been part of this day, just from the outside. As the clock moved past noon, I felt a resolve begin to form beneath the lingering shock. I needed to talk to my neighbor. Not immediately, not in a rush of emotion, but soon. There were things I needed to understand, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the choice they'd made. Whatever they knew, whatever line they'd crossed to warn me, it had mattered. And I owed it to both of us to acknowledge that. I glanced once more at the time, letting the significance of the hour settle fully. Noon had come and gone, carrying with it the explanation my morning had lacked. The warning had been real. The risk had been real. And the life I was living at this moment, the quiet, intact version, was not the only one that had been possible today. That understanding sat with me, heavy and permanent, reshaping my sense of routine, safety, and trust in ways I was only beginning to grasp. I wasn't late to work. I had been spared. I didn't knock on my neighbor's door right away. The instinct to rush across the hall and demand answers was strong, but it felt wrong, like barging into a moment that wasn't finished unfolding yet. Whatever they'd done that morning hadn't been impulsive. It had been measured, deliberate, and timed with a precision that suggested patience rather than panic. I needed to meet that choice with the same restraint. So I waited, letting the afternoon stretch on while the building settled back into its usual rhythm, the crisis receding into something people would eventually call earlier today. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the quiet felt different than it had that morning. Less empty, more expectant. I stood in front of their door for a long moment, my hand hovering inches from the wood, rehearsing nothing in particular. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even afraid anymore. What I felt was a gravity that demanded care, as if the wrong tone or question could fracture something delicate and human. When I knocked, it was softer than the knock that had woken me before dawn, more of a request than a demand. They opened the door almost immediately, as if they'd been waiting. The look they gave me wasn't triumphant or relieved. It was tired. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who'd carried a weight all day and finally set it down. We stood there for a second, mirroring each other's hesitation, until they stepped aside and gestured me in without a word. The apartment looked exactly as I'd imagined it would, neat, spare, quietly lived in. The normalcy of it felt grounding, a reminder that extraordinary decisions often happen in ordinary spaces. "I'm glad you stayed home," they said finally, their voice low and steady. There was no question in it, no fishing for confirmation. They knew. I nodded, unsure where to begin, then settled for the simplest truth. I told them I'd seen the coverage. I told them I understood now why they'd come to my door. Saying it out loud made my chest tighten again, the delayed echo of fear and relief colliding in a way I hadn't fully processed yet. They listened without interrupting, their attention complete and undivided. I asked them how they knew. The question hung between us, heavy with implication. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they sat down, folded their hands together, and took a breath that felt like a threshold. "I didn't know everything," they said carefully. "And I didn't know it would happen exactly when it did. But I knew enough." The way they said enough carried a boundary in it, an acknowledgement of limits as much as knowledge. It told me this wasn't a story that could be told cleanly from start to finish. They explained in fragments, each one offered with restraint. A connection through a former colleague. A conversation overheard that morning, just before dawn, with details that didn't sit right. A pattern they'd seen before, years earlier, in a different place, under different circumstances, where waiting for confirmation had come at a cost they still carried. They didn't dramatize it. They didn't claim certainty. They spoke like someone describing a calculation made under pressure, where the risk of being wrong had to be weighed against the risk of doing nothing. "What made you come to me?" I asked. The question surprised me as it left my mouth, sharper than I'd intended. They met it without flinching. "Because I knew your schedule," they said simply. "Because I knew you'd already be on your way. And because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet and you walked into something I could have helped you avoid." There was no heroism in the answer, no attempt to elevate themselves. Just responsibility, accepted without embellishment. I realized then how much courage it had taken to knock on my door without proof, to ask for trust without explanation, to risk being dismissed or resented or reported. The act itself had been small, just a knock, a sentence. But the decision behind it had been enormous. They had crossed an invisible line that most people never approach, let alone step over. And they'd done it knowing there would be no applause, no acknowledgement beyond the simple fact that I was alive and safe to ask questions now. We talked for a long time after that, not about the incident itself, but about the weight of knowing things early and the loneliness that comes with it. They told me about the first time they'd hesitated, years ago, when they'd chosen to wait for clarity and watched consequences unfold instead. They told me how that memory had surfaced at 4:45 a.m., sharp and insistent, when they'd realized they couldn't repeat the same mistake. Listening, I felt a quiet respect deepen into something sturdier. This wasn't just about me. It was about who they had decided to be when the moment demanded it. I thanked them, awkwardly at first, then more firmly. Gratitude felt insufficient, like trying to cover a debt with spare change. They waved it off gently, insisting there was nothing to thank them for, that this was simply what anyone should do. I didn't argue. Some convictions don't need reinforcement, they need recognition. We sat in a shared silence after that, the kind that doesn't rush to fill itself, each of us processing the day from opposite sides of the same choice. Before I left, they said something that stayed with me long after I crossed back into my own apartment. "I didn't want to scare you," they said. "I just wanted to buy you time." The phrase landed with a clarity that made my throat tighten. Time. That was what the knock had given me. Time to step out of a path I didn't know I was on. Time to live a version of the day that didn't end in sirens and caution tape. Time extended quietly, without explanation, because someone else believed it mattered. Back home, the apartment felt altered again, not provisional this time, but purposeful. I moved through it slowly, touching familiar objects with a renewed awareness of their presence. The day had carved a line through my life, dividing it into before and after, and the dividing point wasn't noon or the news coverage. It was 5:02 a.m., a knock, and a choice made in trust. I sat down, exhausted in a way that went deeper than fatigue, and let the truth settle fully into place. They hadn't just warned me. They'd chosen me. Not because I was special or deserving, but because I was there, because timing had aligned, because they'd decided that one person spared was worth the risk of being wrong. That knowledge carried a responsibility I was only beginning to understand. It asked something of me, not repayment, not obligation, but awareness. A commitment to listen when the moment demanded it. To act when silence felt easier. To remember that sometimes, the smallest interventions change the largest outcomes. They hadn't just warned me. They'd chosen me. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to settle into the version of reality it had known before that morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw two parallel days unfolding side by side, the one I lived, quiet and intact, and the one I didn't, loud with sirens and confusion and consequences that would have rewritten everything I understood about safety and routine. The contrast wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it dramatic. It was subtle, almost mundane. And that was what unsettled me most. The difference between those two lives had been a knock and a sentence and a decision made while half awake. I kept thinking about how easily I could have ignored it. How instinct, pride, and routine had all urged me to do exactly that. I had always believed that danger announced itself clearly, that warnings came with explanations and proof. That belief had made sense, right up until it didn't. Lying there in the dark, I realized how much I'd relied on predictability as a substitute for awareness. I had trusted patterns because they felt stable, not because they were safe. That distinction settled heavily into me, reshaping how I understood the world I moved through every day. The next morning, the city resumed its usual rhythm, but I didn't. I moved through the day slower, more deliberately, noticing details I would have rushed past before. The way people stood closer together on the sidewalk. The way sirens still echoed faintly in places my mind now mapped differently. Messages from work continued to arrive, updates, reassurances, attempts to restore normalcy. I read them carefully, responding when needed, but I felt detached from the urgency to return as if nothing had happened. Something had happened. Even if my body hadn't been there, my life had brushed up against the edge of it. I thought often about the people who had been inside that building when everything unfolded. About how their day would forever be marked by that moment, how before and after would now carry different meanings for them. Survivor's guilt returned in quiet waves, not accusing, just present. I didn't indulge it, but I didn't push it away either. It felt important to acknowledge that my safety hadn't come from merit or foresight. It had come from proximity to someone else's courage. That realization stripped away any temptation to romanticize what had happened. When I finally returned to work days later, the building felt unfamiliar despite being unchanged. Conversations were cautious. Jokes landed awkwardly. People shared their experiences in fragments, each one revealing how differently the same event could be lived depending on where you stood when it began. No one asked me why I hadn't been there that day. Perhaps they didn't want to know. Perhaps they assumed coincidence. I didn't volunteer the story. It didn't feel like mine to center. What mattered wasn't the explanation, it was the lesson I was carrying quietly with me. Outside of work, I found myself re-evaluating small choices with new seriousness acknowledges. I no longer dismissed unease as inconvenience. I no longer treated routine as inherently protective. I didn't become paranoid or withdrawn, if anything, I became more present. I listened more closely to people, to pauses in conversations, to instincts that surfaced without language. I understood now that intuition wasn't mystical or dramatic. It was pattern recognition built from experience, often operating faster than conscious thought. My neighbor had recognized a pattern. I had listened. Together, those two actions had altered my path. I ran into my neighbor a few days later in the hallway, both of us carrying groceries, exchanging the same polite nod we always had. Nothing about the interaction signaled what had passed between us. And yet, there was a shared understanding there, subtle but solid. We didn't speak about that morning again. We didn't need to. The gratitude I felt didn't require repetition, and the choice they'd made didn't need ongoing acknowledgement to remain significant. Some things are meant to settle into the background, quietly shaping how you move forward. What changed most was my relationship with certainty. I stopped expecting the world to explain itself before asking me to act. I stopped assuming that waiting for proof was always the most responsible choice. Sometimes, responsibility looks like interruption. Like stepping in early and accepting the discomfort of not being able to justify yourself right away. That lesson stayed with me, influencing decisions that had nothing to do with danger or work, how I showed up for people, how I responded when something felt off, how I weighed silence against action. I also learned something about trust that day. Not blind trust, not obedience without thought, but a deeper kind, the kind that recognizes when someone is acting from a place of care rather than control. My neighbor hadn't demanded anything from me. They hadn't pressured or explained or lingered. They had offered me information in its simplest form and trusted me to decide. That respect mattered. It was the reason I listened. And it made me more mindful of how I approached others when I felt compelled to intervene in small ways. There was a version of me who would have brushed this off eventually, filed it away as a strange story to tell later, a coincidence amplified by hindsight. That version of me didn't survive the day. In its place was someone more attuned to the fragility of ordinary mornings and the weight of choices that feel insignificant when you make them. I didn't become reckless. I became attentive. I understood now that safety isn't guaranteed by showing up on time or following the plan. Sometimes it's preserved by stepping aside when the plan doesn't feel right. The life I didn't live lingered with me, not as a haunting, but as a reminder. A reminder that proximity can be destiny, that timing can be merciless, and that intervention doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor in the hallway at dawn, asking you to trust them without explanation. Sometimes it looks like choosing inconvenience over certainty and sitting with the discomfort of not knowing why, until you do. I didn't make any dramatic changes after that. I didn't quit my job or move away or reinvent myself considered a deliberate boundary. I would no longer ignore my instincts simply because they were inconvenient. I would no longer assume that explanations always came first. And I would no longer underestimate the quiet ways people look out for each other, even when they never ask to be seen for it. That boundary wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It reshaped how I moved through the world in ways no one else could see, but I could feel. Looking back now, the moment that defined that day wasn't the news at noon or the conversation that followed. It was the choice I made before sunrise, when routine pulled one way and trust pulled another. I chose to listen. And in doing so, I chose a life that continued. The other one, the one filled with sirens and uncertainty and aftermath, remains a possibility I acknowledge without dwelling on. It reminds me that every day I wake up and follow my routine is a gift, not a guarantee. If you've ever had a moment where someone told you to pause, to listen, to trust without explanation, and you did, you understand how fragile and powerful those moments are. Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the smallest decisions save us from lives we were never meant to live. And if this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and subscribe for more real stories about intuition, trust, and the quiet moments that change everything.